So what's the deal with the British Army? In my previous video, I talked in broad terms about the British military and the various dilemmas that the British military faces. But I also promised a second video in which I would focus on the Army. So that's what I'm going to do in this video. Also, some of the comments that I got about the first video complained that I didn't really say much about the state of the British military, and I deliberately did not, just for the sake of brevity. In this video, I believe that I need to do that. I can't avoid doing that and talking about the problems that the British Army currently faces. So, thus, in this video, I'm going to talk first, give a presentation of sort of the state of the British Army, and then talk about the dilemmas and the challenges that it faces. My name is Michael Shurkin, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Pax Americana, a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be in my mind. I don't think it's a radical or controversial thing to say that the British Army currently is in a deplorable state. And it's in a deplorable state for a number of reasons, or in a number of ways, maybe I should say. Perhaps the first thing that needs to be addressed is the size of the British Army at this point. The British Army has consistently been shrinking for the last 10, 20, 30 years. At this point, it's down to about 73,000 men and women. The last time the British Army was this size was, according to the data that I've been able to find, it was actually in the 1820s, and thus not even during the Victorian era. I believe this is still what's known as the Georgian era. In 1989, at the end of the Cold War, the British Army stood at about 156,000 men and women. Now, is the small size of the British Army today a problem? Well, honestly, it's debatable, but it does obviously beg questions about what you can do and what you can achieve with a force that's that big. It means that the force would struggle to deploy a large force, it would struggle to sustain that large force, and it would struggle to do more than one thing at the same time. So what are you going to do with it? Just for point of comparison, the French army today has about 120,000 men and women, of which 77,000 are categorized as deployable, which means that the subsection of the French army that the French army regards as deployable is larger than the total size of the British army, and that, I believe, says a lot. The Italian army, by the way, has about 98,000 people. Just as an aside, I think that the Italian military is all too often overlooked. It's actually large, very capable, and does some really interesting things, but close parentheses there. The other big problem with the British Army is that it suffers from decades of deferred and failed modernization. A large quantity of British Army equipment is old and absolutely and arguably obsolete, and the efforts to update it have been remarkable failures. A case in point is the failure of the FRES program that began in the 2000s. FRES, which stands for Future Rapid Effect System, and already the fact that they're using buzzwords like effects and future rapid, like what does this even mean? That should already be a red flag to anybody. Like anytime an army trots out something like that, you should be very, very suspicious. FRES was supposed to result in 3 separate families of medium armored vehicles that would replace obsolete equipment. And each of these 3 vehicle families were supposed to be loaded to the gills with the latest in digital network technology and have all sorts of fancy high-tech capabilities, etc. The program failed. The only part of FRES that has survived is what we now know as the Ajax. So Ajax represents 1 family of vehicles. Remember, there's supposed to be 3, but now you're only getting 1. And Ajax is, well, the whole Ajax program has been just fraught with all sorts of real serious problems. The Ajax was based on a design that dates to the 1990s. The Ministry of Defense picked the Ajax program, the Ajax model, in 2010, and the plan was for Ajax to be delivered to the British Army in 2017. Now, after numerous delays, the Army is talking about it becoming fully operational no earlier than late 2028. The total cost of the Ajax program, according to one of the House of Commons reports that I found, is expected to reach £5.5 billion. Also, in part to fill these capability gaps left by the failure of FRES, because remember, there's supposed to be 3 families of vehicles, the British Army also relatively recently decided to purchase the German Boxer. The selection was made in 2018, and I believe it's only now starting to show up in British Army inventories. There's also long been a plan to upgrade Britain's Challenger 2 tanks to a higher spec or to replace them with something called the Challenger 3, which is just going to be modernized Challenger 2s. I don't know what they're what the difference is, but whatever. This plan also has long been delayed by budget cuts, so they keep kind of kicking the can down the road of modernizing the Challenger 2s. I mean, at this point, most people regard the Challenger 2 as it's still an excellent tank, but it's just not up to snuff in regard to sort of the latest advances in armored warfare and the latest and greatest. By the way, Britain now has officially 220 Challenger tanks remaining in its inventory. It had over 1,000 main battle tanks during the Cold War. I do not know if one has to subtract from that 220 the number of Challenger tanks that Britain gave to Ukraine. I don't know if they took them out of that fleet of 220 or if they pulled them out of some storage facility somewhere where they were kind of relegated to decrepitude and maybe cannibalized for parts and just sort of fixed up and sent off to Ukraine. I really don't know. I'm not against, by the way, giving the Challengers to Ukraine. I think that's a really great thing to do. So this is not a critique of that policy. But I'm just saying that it's further weakened the British task, a tank fleet and tank force. Now, in the meantime, the Ukraine war has highlighted another number of capabilities that analysts such as the ones at RUSI, guys like Jack Watling, have identified as essential now for modern warfare, particularly if you're going to go up against somebody like the Russians. These are things that the British either have but in insufficient quantities, or have but it's just obsolete because they've neglected certain capabilities since the end of the Cold War, or they simply don't have it all. But either way, all these things are things that the British Army needs to get up to snuff if it wants to, again, take seriously the idea of doing something like fighting the Russians. We're talking about tube artillery, we're talking about rocket artillery, we're talking about long-range fires, we're talking about drones, counter-drone capabilities, ISR, counter-ISR capabilities, electronic warfare, cyber warfare, and I believe also breaching capabilities, the ability to, sapper stuff, the ability to breach minefields, to breach fortifications, maybe by putting plows on tanks. There's all sorts of stuff that you need to do that kind of thing. Most of these things are things that the British Army already has, but just not up to date and not in anything like a sufficient scale for doing something like taking on the Russians. Also, the Ukraine war put into stark relief the fact that the British Army, given its size, would struggle to deploy a large force and to sustain that force. So what does that mean, large? It's hard to pin down how much would be enough. The question is, what size of a force is going to be large enough and effective enough to make a valuable contribution to the battlefield, on the battlefield, assuming also that this is in a context of fighting alongside one's NATO allies. And I don't think anybody has a clear answer to this question. Is a brigade enough? With throwing a British Army brigade into some sort of coalition battle, is this Army brigade going to be useful? I mean, British Army brigade, pound for pound, is a really effective fighting force. On the other hand, it needs various sustainment capabilities and support capabilities, and maybe it's just going to be a burden. Like maybe the Americans are going to have to supply so much to back it up that maybe from an American point of view, they'd be better off without the British there, right? It's all debatable how much is really enough. But at this point, like the British would struggle to come up with a brigade or maybe two brigades and sustain them in the fight, and that's not even to talk about burning through ammunition or dealing with attrition, but it would be a heavy lift. So again, the small size of the British Army at this point really raises a lot of questions about whether or not it really even can contribute to a major fight, even if it's conducting this fight alongside its NATO allies. I mean, the safe way of saying this is that basically the Ukraine war has reminded everybody that there's really no substitute for mass. The British Army does not have mass. The British Army is never, well, not never, but it's not going to have mass, at least anytime soon. Absent mass, what can it really do that's actually meaningful and useful? The British Army also suffers from having thin stores of ammunition, missiles, that sort of thing. There's a lot of equipment that just does not have enough of. It never had enough of, but now they've given a lot of these stores to Ukrainians. Again, I think that's actually an excellent thing to do, but it just heightens the reality that the Ukraine war has made clear that Britain itself needs to have large numbers of artillery shells and anti-tank rockets and all this kind of good stuff, but it didn't have enough, and oh, by the way, it gave away a lot of it, which means they're going to have to spend even more money in order to first replenish the stocks that they already have, but they also have to expand these stocks. There's also a problem that the British face, which is with the missing defense industrial capacity. I think that Britain has not managed its military industry very well. The fact that the British had to turn to Germany to purchase Boxers, I think, just points to the fact that, I mean, the reality is this means that the British defense industry was not capable of meeting the British Army's needs. So the British Army had to turn to the Germans. Is this a bad thing? I mean, arguably, it's a cheaper thing. Buying something off the shelf from the Germans or the French or the Italians is probably a much safer way to go than developing your own thing. But at the same time, there are all sorts of issues having to do with autonomy, strategic autonomy, not having other countries have a vote in whether or not you could use your military equipment for any specific purpose. I also think it's true that if you build your own military equipment, it's valuable. There's a real economic benefit, because if you're giving this money to British companies, the British companies therefore are paying people salaries. Those people are using the money to do all sorts of things, including paying taxes. And defense spending can have some profound economic benefits. You're not actually throwing the money away. You're actually investing it in your own economy. The failure of FRES really points to Britain's inability since the end of the Cold War to deliver major weapons systems. And the results, I think, have been very deleterious for the British Army. Just to cite one bit that I pulled out of a House of Commons report, it talked about how the history of the Army's armored fighting vehicle capability is deplorable. And then in 2022, the Public Accounts Committee judged that the MOD's management of the Ajax program was flawed from the outset. And then it later cites this other study saying that the Ministry of Defense had not managed the programs effectively, and it warned that the program still faced significant challenges. Now, I would argue that the heart of the problem is twofold. One is budget cuts. There's just not enough money. But perhaps more serious than the budget cuts is the inconsistency of the defense spending. It's one thing if you know the budget's going to be cut, and then after the cuts, it's going to be a certain amount of money, and it's going to be fairly predictable for at least the next, let's say, 5 years. And then you can plan accordingly. I think that what's happened in Britain is that they keep changing their mind, and they keep promising and then failing to deliver on the promises. And ultimately, the funding has been unstable, which has made everything much more difficult to plan. And it gets even worse if you're being told different things, that maybe you will have money, maybe you'll have less money, maybe you'll have more, maybe you'll have this, maybe you'll have that. Again, it's all very difficult to plan. I think that the real core of the problem, besides the budgets, is that since the end of the Cold War, the British military and certainly the British Army have been struggling to figure out what kind of force they actually need to be. I mean, Britain can't decide what kind of military does it need, what kind of army does it need, what's the purpose of an army. And if you don't know what the army's for, it's hard to know what kind of equipment it needs. It's hard to know what kind of force structure it needs. What has muddied the waters also is the fact that, besides the fact that with the end of the Cold War, the conventional threat, once represented by the Soviets, sort of disappeared from the agenda. But now, because of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, there's clearly a greater need for meeting the requirements of expeditionary warfare. So there's thus a move, or an inclination to move, towards lighter, medium to light forces, things that you can send to Afghanistan, things that you can sustain in Afghanistan. Also, the sheer expense of Afghanistan and Iraq, the sheer expense of the Helmand operations, for example, took away a lot of already shrinking funds, and is a major reason why modernization programs like modernizing the Challenger 2 have continuously been deferred, just because the money always ended up going somewhere else. Let's look at this bit here that I took from a recent House of Commons report that I think really kind of says it all. And it's talking about FRIZ, and it's talking about the armored vehicles. And it says the following: the perceived loss of a challenging but known threat in the form of the armored forces of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact meant that the British Army has struggled to define its role. Since at least the 1990s, it has tried to move to a more deployable, medium-weight armored force suitable for expeditionary warfare against unforeseeable opponents. However, indecision around the actual requirements, a desire to have the latest (parentheses immature, which I applaud that parentheses) technology, operational experience, and a lack of stable funding for its programs means that the British Army's armored fighting vehicle fleet currently faces mass obsolescence and requires significant funding for its modernization. At the same time, the UK is reviewing its future defense and security posture and what this means for traditional military capabilities. Therefore, the Army's armored fighting vehicle programs and capabilities capability is now vulnerable when weighed against the desire to fund other parties such as cyber, information warfare, and other capabilities. So again, this just points to the fact that the modernization programs have failed because of uncertainty, because of uncertain budgets. Now that they're hoping to sort of get their house in order, there are also all these other capabilities that they know they need to fund. And what this means is that it creates the possibility that they're never going to actually have the modernization programs that they want, or they have to spread the money thinly so that they can have a little bit of modernization, but thus have money left over for developing some of the new capabilities. So it just means there's greater demand for scarcer resources, while the need for modernizing the force remains open. They have not satisfied this requirement. In the past decade, the British Army has been toying with specialization. Basically, there are two divisions in the British Army, and the British have been talking about how like one division should be sort of should maintain legacy conventional military capabilities, while the other division would be lighter, more geared towards like peacekeeping operations, stability operations. It should be more mobile. It should be more reliant, by the way, on reserve forces, and it should be expeditionary. And it would do stuff in Africa. It would do stuff wherever. But it was never really clear also how well that would work, and also this new idea of having reserve forces supply a portion of the manpower for the sort of lighter expeditionary division raised concerns about the dangers of an empty force, because the reality is that the British Army's reserve program is not really adequate. Rather, it's like a new thing. It's being developed. It's not nearly as robust as the American Reserve and National Guard system. And thus there's real skepticism about whether or not the reserves can supply the kind of manpower they need. And yet the units of that expeditionary division were counting on people showing up from the reserve forces. But if those people don't show up, then you've got a problem, because then these units are going to be undermanned. So now you have a readiness problem on top of everything else. Since then, it seems that basically this idea of having a two-speed army has more or less survived, although people are thinking about it in different ways. One concept that I want to flag is something that the really good British Army analyst Nicholas Drummond has been espousing. Nick Drummond he's a consultant. He's very well known in the industry, and I think a lot of the ideas that he's put forth, he's got a blog on this stuff, is actually very useful and very informative. But he talks about the two-speed army in terms of not heavy versus light, or rather conventional warfare versus lower intensity warfare. He's trying to conceive of it in terms of the first battle versus the deep battle. The idea is that the first battle is largely defensive. So the Russians attack. That requires coping with a defensive battle. You can get away with lighter forces, but more importantly, what's really useful in that kind of fight is maneuverability, mobility. So having lighter but more mobile forces has real value. The challenge then comes in clawing back lost territory. That's going to require heavier maneuver forces with much more firepower and much more mass than the lighter forces that were used to absorb the initial shock. It's still two divisions, it's still two kinds of capabilities, but all of which he's conceiving in terms of contributing to a heavy conventional fight, rather than dividing between doing like a division of labor between conventional warfare and later forms of warfare. I think is a really interesting idea. So what would the British Army like to do? This is where we talk about competing ambitions, and this section is a lot like the thing that I did in the previous video where I talked about the British military's ambitions writ large. One thing the British Army would like is mass, but this isn't going to happen, and it knows that. Modernization. Well, it's happening, but in bits and pieces and incrementally, slowly. Boxers happening slowly, Ajax happening slowly, the Challenger 3 modernization will eventually take place. These things are all happening while bit by bit the British are going to acquire more missiles, more long-range fires, more rocket artillery, etc., etc. I doubt it's going to do any of these things in the kind of numbers that anybody would like. That might be useful, but it's going to move ahead bit by bit incrementally, trying to sort of piece together and trying to sort of address these different capability gaps that it's going to have. The British Army would also like to boost digitization and digital integration, and This is something that it's counting on. It's been counting on this since the beginning of FRES, but it's counting on this in order to try to optimize the value of what it already has. And the basic idea, and this is something shared by the Americans, the French, the Italians, the idea is that in lieu of numbers, in lieu of mass, what you do is you try to get as much as you possibly can from what you have. And the way you do this is through networking technologies that's going to allow your forces at the lower echelons to share information and to work collaboratively. The battle value of this, I think, is debatable. I don't think it's proven. It's also expensive, but this is something that the British Army is betting on heavily. The British Army, of course, also wants to reinvest in the atrophied capabilities like artillery, rocket artillery, long-range fires, air defense, electronic warfare, while investing in new capabilities, drones, counter-drones, cyber, etc. It wants to rebuild its inventories and make them larger than they were before, because we now know because of Ukraine, inventories have to be much larger, and somehow reinvigorate or rebuild the defense industry to give it more capacity. I've yet to read any good, clear proposals about how you actually do that, but it is on the list of things to do. So these are all the different ambitions, and it's really hard to say how the British Army can possibly balance all these and how it's going to prioritize among them. And then, of course, the British Army cannot escape the larger context that I addressed in the first video, which is how Britain allocates resources amongst the three branches. The British Army, or rather the British defense budget, is unlikely to grow in any meaningful way, just based on what I've been reading about the sort of the noises coming out of the new Labour government, that they'd like to, but economic reality and fiscal realities keep getting in the way. They have priorities like rebuilding the NHS and things like that. Even assuming the British military gets more money, I am suspicious that the British Army is going to benefit less from any budget bumps than the Royal Navy or the Royal Air Force. There are more pressing things to spend the money on that might ultimately have greater value for the UK's security needs than better equipping the British Army, particularly if they're never going to be able to grow the British Army significantly. It's not going to get any larger. And there are all these questions about how useful is the British Army ever going to be anyways in any kind of large conventional force. I think it's easier to understand the value of an F-35. It's easier to understand the value of new frigates or new minesweepers or ASW capabilities, submarines, that kind of thing. So what options does the Army have? One is really to give up on the idea of being able to make a useful contribution on the battlefield, to join the fight in Ukraine with heavy ground forces. Perhaps all one should do is simply aim to preserve capabilities. You need to have the institutional capability. You need to have guys around who know how to fight a tank battle. You need tanks and people who know how to operate them. You need to know how to use them in combat. Even if you don't have enough of them to use them actually in war, but you still need to remember how to do it, because one day you might need them. One day one might have to expand that force. There might be a really compelling reason to spend a lot of money to now double the size of the British tank force. And it's easier to do that if you retain that institutional knowledge, if you still know how to use tanks, know how to fight tanks, etc. So just getting rid of tanks, getting rid of armored warfare, it's a really bad idea. But maybe you just give up on having enough of them to be useful. I think another thing that the British Army needs to take seriously is the idea that perhaps it doesn't need to meet the Russians toe-to-toe in Eastern Europe, given that the Poles are going to be there in very large numbers, the Germans are going to be there, other NATO allies are going to be there. It's no longer a case where it's up to Britain and France to defend Europe from the Soviet Union. The coalition's larger, the Warsaw Pact is gone. The Poles are buying weapons, as quickly as they can. The Polish military is well on its way to outstripping the British military in terms of capabilities. So let them fight that war. Maybe, for instance, the British Army needs to think about some sort of specialization. For example, maybe helping the Scandinavians, maybe helping the Finns, maybe securing Norway. Maybe there are things that they could do in the Arctic. This is just an example. So what you need to think about, well, what kind of forces would you need to help shore up the Norwegians in case of a war, or to help the Finns, where you know that the Finns are going to be responsible for providing the mass and most of the firepower, but maybe there are ways that you can slot in such that you can help them. I don't really have answers to these questions, and I think that the real priority for the Army at this point is simply to make decisions. Just decide. Pick something. Pick a model, and then stick with it. because I think it's the indecision that's really the reason why the British Army is in the sorry state that it is now. So everything I've said so far, I think, raises a really interesting question, which is whether or not conventional warfare today has become too expensive for anybody but the United States and perhaps countries like Poland, which have the advantage of being single-minded in their purpose. The Polish military has really only one mission today, which is fighting Russians. And if that's your thing, if that's the entire reason for you to exist, it's relatively easy to figure out what kind of army you need and what kind of weapons you need to develop and what kind of weapons you need to purchase, and you go ahead and do that. Other countries, however, in NATO don't have that singularity of purpose. They also don't have the political will. They don't feel the same need that the Poles do, and maybe the Finns or the Swedes, to ramp up their defense spending. I think unless and until European militaries decide that they really need to spend a lot more money, they're going to be stuck with these sort of bonsai armies. By bonsai, I refer to the tree. The idea, it's like, it's this little shrub-sized thing, but it's looks like a 200-year-old oak tree, but it's a complete thing, but it's a small thing, and often that small just isn't good enough. But that's really what we're looking at, and that's what the British now are looking at. They're stuck with something like a bonsai army, although it's not even adequate because too many capabilities are missing, and they can't quite figure out how to fix that, how to make it more complete, knowing that it'll never be more than a bonsai army. And this situation is going to remain the case until, again, the British population just decides that it's okay to bump up the defense budget, to aim for like 3% GDP. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. Thank you very much. In the description, I put some articles that I think are relevant to this discussion, including some of the things that I cited, some of the work from Rusi, some of the House of Commons and House of Lords reports that I read. I've also put in links for my Substack, Pax Americana. Please check that out. I also have links to my Twitter and LinkedIn account, and then last but not least, a link to my own website, michaelshirkin.com. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing you in my next video. Bye-bye.